The biting wind was a physical blow, tearing at the thin fabric of her dress, a constant reminder of everything lost. Eleanor stumbled, her legs numb tree stumps beneath her, the frozen earth unforgiving. Ash coated the air, a fine gray snowfall that wasn't snow, catching in her raw throat with every ragged breath. Behind her, the place that had been home smoldered, a funeral pyre for everyone she had ever known, for a life already impossibly distant. She was alone. The word echoed in the vast, indifferent silence of the wilderness, a chilling pronouncement. No cries answered hers, long since hoarse and broken, just the wind, and the creak of unseen branches, and the frantic pounding of her own heart, a drumbeat against the hollow silence of the world. She walked, driven by a primal instinct more than conscious thought. Away, further away from the smoke, the smell, the ghosts. The cold seeped into her bones, promising a different kind of end. She saw the structure through the trees, a dark, hunched shape against the bruised twilight sky. Not grand, not welcoming, but solid. Wood, shelter, hope, a fragile, dangerous thing she barely dared to grasp. The cabin listed slightly, its timbers weathered silver gray, its windows dark, empty eyes. The door hung ajar, groaning like a sigh of despair as she pushed it inward. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust, mice, and something long abandoned. It was brutally cold, but less so than outside. Less wind. A haven of sorts. A single room, dominated by a stone hearth choked with old ash. A rough table, 2 backless chairs. A narrow, sagging cot piled with what looked like mildewed blankets. It smelled of decay, of neglect, of time standing still. But it had 4 walls and a roof that, miraculously, didn't appear to leak. Collapsing against the doorframe, Eleanor slid to the floor, the cold would a shock against her skin even through her dress. Tears tracked paths through the grime on her cheeks, silent and futile. She didn't know how long she sat there, shivering, listening to the wind howl outside, a wolf circling the edges of her temporary safety. Every creak of the cabin, every scuttling sound in the walls, sent a fresh wave of terror through her. This place was empty, but not uninhabited by fear. She was just a girl, barely 18, who had seen things no one should ever see, who carried the weight of a massacre in the numb space where her heart should be. There was no plan, no destination, just survival, moment to moment, a desperate, animal drive to keep breathing. She curled into a ball, pulling the tattered remnants of her dress around her shoulders, and closed her eyes, praying for an end to the night, or perhaps just an end. The cabin offered little comfort. The cot was hard, the blankets rank. Eleanor huddled on the floor instead, near the cold hearth, imagining warmth. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, a dull, persistent ache. Thirst was a rasp in her throat. The first few days were a blur of fear and scavenging. She found a rusty tin cup, a cracked plate, a half-empty sack of flour riddled with weevils, and a few dented cans whose labels were long gone. Water came from a partially frozen creek some distance away, a perilous journey made under the cover of the sparse trees. Each trip felt like stepping back into the danger she had fled. She moved like a ghost, silent, jumpy, eyes wide and scanning. The silence of the wilderness was not empty. It was filled with potential threats she couldn't yet identify. She managed to get a fire going in the hearth eventually, using dry leaves and brittle twigs found near the cabin, coaxing a reluctant flame with shaking hands and a prayer. The smoke filled the cabin at first, stinging her eyes, before finding its way up the chimney. The warmth was a miracle, a temporary reprieve from the gnawing cold. It cast dancing shadows that seemed to watch her, but it also pushed back the oppressive darkness. She ate the weevil-ridden flour mixed with water, cooked into a thin, gray paste over the fire. It was tasteless, gritty, but it filled the emptiness inside her. Survival was a grim, unceasing task. There was no time for grief, only for the next breath, the next meager meal, the next night endured. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of purple and gray, she saw him. A figure on horseback, emerging from the trees as silently as smoke. He was large, cloaked, indistinct in the failing light. Eleanor froze, pressed against the cabin wall, heart hammering against her ribs. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. He didn't approach the cabin directly. Instead, he went to the creek, watered his horse, then seemed to look around, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, the trees, the surrounding land. He had the air of someone who belonged to this harsh place, someone who noticed everything. He didn't call out, didn't make a sudden move, just observed. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Eleanor barely dared to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, he led his horse away, melting back into the trees the way he had come. He hadn't come to the cabin. He hadn't spoken. But he knew. He knew she was here. The realization settled deep in her gut, cold and heavy. Was he a threat? Another one? Or something else? She didn't sleep that night, listening, waiting. The next day, she found a freshly caught rabbit left near the cabin door, cleaned and ready for skinning. No note, no sign of the man. Just the rabbit. A gift? A warning? She stared at it, suspicion warring with desperate hunger. She skinned and cooked it over her fire, the smell of roasting meat intoxicating. As she ate, slowly, cautiously, she watched the tree line, wondering about the silent stranger who knew she was here. Days turned into a week, then two. The silent man appeared intermittently. He never came close to the cabin while she was outside. Sometimes she would just glimpse him, watching from a distance, before he disappeared. Other times she would find something left near the door. A snare he had set, a small pile of firewood, sometimes food, a piece of dried meat, a handful of foraged berries. He was like a phantom caretaker, providing what she needed without ever acknowledging her directly. Eleanor, in turn, didn't try to approach him. Her fear was still too potent, her voice still locked away by trauma. But the fear of him was slowly being replaced by a cautious curiosity, a tentative gratitude. He could have hurt her. He could have driven her away. Instead, he offered silent, unsolicited aid. His name, she learned later, was Silas. It was a name as spare and solid as the man himself. He was a trapper, living alone in the wilderness, his own history etched in the lines around his eyes and the quiet solitude that clung to him like the scent of pine smoke. One morning, she was by the creek, washing her face, when she heard his horse nearby. She froze but didn't flee this time. He dismounted and approached the water a short distance upstream, his back to her. He moved with a quiet competence, accustomed to being alone, to the watchful silence of the wild. He dipped his hands in the water, washed his face, and then, without turning, spoke. His voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together. "You can use the stream. Don't need to hide." It was the first human voice she had heard directed at her since. It startled her so much she nearly fell in. She stayed frozen, unable to speak. He didn't press. He finished his business, mounted his horse, and rode off, disappearing back into the trees. But the barrier was broken. A few days later, he arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon, the sun high enough to cut through the chill. He had a pack on his back, tools. He didn't ask permission. He simply set about repairing the sagging doorframe, hammering in new nails, straightening the wood. Eleanor watched him from inside, through the open doorway. He worked with quiet efficiency, his focus entirely on the task. He didn't look at her. When he finished, the door hung straight, closing with a solid thud for the first time. He gathered his tools. "Gets cold at night," he said, his gaze finally meeting hers for a fleeting moment. His eyes were the color of deep water, unreadable but not unkind. Then he left. He didn't expect thanks. He didn't seem to expect anything. He just did what needed doing. And in his silent actions, a fragile tendril of trust began to grow in Eleanor's barren heart. The silent repairs continued. He fixed a loose roof shingle, shored up the porch step, even dug a small latrine a discreet distance from the cabin. He brought larger game now, a deer he had butchered, leaving cuts of meat wrapped in hide. He showed her how to smoke it, demonstrating the process with minimal gestures and even fewer words. Eleanor, tentatively, began to speak. Short, hesitant questions at first. How long does it need? Where did you find this? Silas answered just as sparingly, his voice a low rumble. He didn't ask about her past, didn't pry into the tragedy that had left her here. He treated her with a quiet respect, like a fellow inhabitant of this harsh world, rather than a victim. Slowly, her numb fear began to recede, replaced by a quiet determination. She learned to track, to identify edible plants, to handle the heavy rifle Silas left leaning against the cabin wall one day. She learned to shoot, the recoil bruising her shoulder, the loud crack echoing in the silence, a stark contrast to the quiet life she was building. Silas watched her practice sometimes, offering a rare nod of approval or a brief instruction. He was teaching her to survive, not just endure. The cabin, once a place of temporary refuge filled with ghosts, was beginning to feel like home. She cleaned it, made the cot habitable, even found a wild vine and trained it to grow around the doorframe. Life, against all odds, was taking root. Their quiet routine was shattered one frigid afternoon. Eleanor was inside, tending the fire, when she heard the sound of horses, more than one, approaching rapidly. Not Silas's familiar pace. These were riders moving with purpose, with urgency. She froze, rifle instantly in hand, her newfound skills replacing instinctual fear. Silas appeared at the edge of the clearing, his face grim. He didn't hesitate. He came straight to the cabin, entering without a word. "They're looking for you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Heard talk in town. They know you got away." Want to silence the only witness. Eleanor's blood ran cold. They hadn't just been raiders. They had been careful, methodical, and they knew she was the only survivor. Silas moved around the cabin, barring the door, checking the windows. He didn't ask if she was ready, if she was scared. He just acted. "Hide," he ordered, gesturing towards the small root cellar beneath a loose floorboard. "And stay quiet." But Eleanor didn't just hide. She felt a surge of something hot and hard in her chest. Not just fear, but defiance. She had survived the first time. She wouldn't be hunted down like an animal now. "No," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands on the rifle. Silas paused, looking at her, surprised. Her eyes met his, not pleading, but determined. "They won't find me an easy target this time. Not here." A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He nodded, a single, decisive movement. The partnership forged in silence and necessity was solidified in the face of danger. They would face this together. The riders reached the cabin, their shouts tearing through the quiet afternoon. They were rough men, their faces hard, their intentions clear. They demanded she come out, threatened to burn the cabin down. Eleanor stood by the window, Silas by the door, both armed, both silent. The air crackled with tension. One of the men dismounted, starting towards the cabin, an axe in his hand. Silas raised his rifle. "Get back," he warned, his voice dangerously quiet. The man laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Just a girl and some hermit? We'll burn you out." The axe swung, biting into the doorframe where Silas had made repairs. The sound was a violation. Silas fired. The shot echoed, sharp and final. The attacker cried out, clutching his shoulder, staggering back. The other riders scattered, surprised by the resistance. They exchanged shouts, weighing the cost of their mission against the sudden danger. They hadn't expected the hermit to be armed and willing to use it, hadn't expected the girl to have someone protecting her. After a tense standoff, filled with threats and the smell of gunpowder, they mounted up and retreated, promising to return. Silas watched them go, his rifle still raised. Eleanor stood beside him, her own rifle heavy in her hands, her heart still pounding but no longer with pure terror. She had faced the specter of her past, and she hadn't broken. In the aftermath, the silence returned, but it was different now. Not the empty, terrifying silence of being alone, but the shared quiet of two people who had faced a threat and survived, together. Silas lowered his rifle, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He looked at Eleanor, a long, assessing look. "You did good," he said, the highest praise she had ever heard from him. She nodded, unable to find words. The cabin smelled of smoke and fear, but it also smelled of resilience. The external threat had forced them out of the shadows of unspoken understanding and into the clear light of partnership. Eleanor was no longer just the survivor seeking refuge. She was a woman who had found her footing in a brutal world, side by side with a man who had quietly offered her the means to do so. The attackers didn't return, at least not openly. Perhaps the risk was too high, or perhaps Silas's reputation, whatever it was, preceded him. Life settled back into a routine, but a changed one. The isolation remained, but the loneliness was gone. Eleanor and Silas shared the cabin now, not as strangers, but as companions. They spoke more freely, sharing the quiet moments by the fire, the tasks of survival. Silas told her stories of the mountains, of the animals, of a life lived outside the bounds of settled society. Eleanor, in turn, began to speak, slowly at first, of the life she had lost, the people she had loved. Healing was a long, slow process, like the changing of the seasons in the mountains. She had arrived at the cabin broken, a child lost in a storm of grief and fear. She had found shelter, then a quiet protector, and finally, strength forged in necessity and shared danger. The world outside could still be cruel, but within these rough-hewn walls, and within herself, she had found a place of safety and belonging. She was no longer just the girl who survived. She was Eleanor, a woman of the mountains, resilient and capable. Silas was not a rescuer in the traditional sense, but a silent guide who had shown her the path to her own strength. Their life together was simple, marked by the rhythms of the natural world and the quiet understanding between them. It was a life built on the ruins of the past, yes, but one looking resolutely towards the future, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to find light even in the deepest darkness.